Welcome to the Packaging Scholars Podcast, the show where we discuss technical packaging topics to enable you to make educated packaging decisions for your company. Today I have with me Susan Thoman from CMA, and today we're going to talk about compostable packaging. We are going to discuss what is compostable packaging, why are the materials important, are some materials better than others, and the whole I don't see composting in my neighborhood, why not? And also the kind of the hope for the future of composting. So without further ado, this is Susan Thoman, and I'll let her do an introduction and a brief history on CMA.
Great. Jessica, it's great to be here today, And so I run the Compost Manufacturing Alliance. I'm the founder. I started it in 2017 after spending 14 years in a major composting company in the Seattle area. And about the time food scrap program started, which was like 2006, 2007, that was really sort of pioneering a whole new area for commercial collection of compostable materials, food scraps, and things from office buildings. And there was a request that, hey, if we're going to, serve lunches and compost our food scraps, what about the packaging? Could we use compostable packaging? So when we started in, talking about packaging as composters, there wasn't a lot of knowledge about, what's compostable. And I think we all assumed, well, all paper's compostable and all wood's compostable. So we had this sort of, rudimentary knowledge of packaging, but came to find out later there was a lot more we needed to learn. So one of the things that happened over time as we began to take food service packaging from commercial entities is we found those materials weren't really breaking down in the time frame we needed them to. And if you think about it this way, if you go out and source a compostable set of food service items, you ship them on a truck to a composter, the composter puts them in their process, and at the end they don't break down. That composter has to screen them out and landfill them. So basically, you spend a premium price to take that compostable on a really long ride to the landfill. So CMA does field testing of compostables to vet that piece of their performance in the piles. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more questions coming up in the interview where I can expound on that a little bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great place to start is sort of that long journey to the landfill and really understanding what is compostable packaging, how do we prevent it from getting to the landfill, and what's the difference between something that's compostable in an industrial setting versus something that's compostable in your backyard, right? Because like a lot of people have food scraps and maybe some wood chips that go into a composter in their backyard, but that's not where you're going to see, compostable packaging break down, right? So there's like a difference between industrial and backyard. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, excellent question, Jessica. Yes, so your industrial facilities clearly are built to do a lot of volume. So you generally build a facility for composting through policies that push through regions, that push through cities, that go out to bid for that. And the hauling companies generally have contracts with the processors, whether they're recyclers or composters. So to have a program in your area takes policies, municipal planning, and money. You need capital to build these facilities. So industrial compost facilities are built for that volume. So that's a big difference between doing 5 or 6 yards in the back of your yard. When you're taking in, for instance, the composter I've worked here in the Seattle area takes in over 400,000 tons a year. So they have 2 facilities. That's a lot of material to process. So in our state, in many states now, it's a regulated industry, meaning that you have to have a permit. You have air quality, water quality, and also health department, supervision or regulators that oversee the site. You have to get a permit often to, pitch your operating plan, and then over time those things are modified. So industrial composting employs a lot of technology as well. So if you think about your home compost pile, you take your leaves, your grass, your food scraps, and you set them out there, and then you turn it occasionally to aerate it, and then you let it sit for a while and be static. Well, big industrial composters either use technology, machines, or big equipment to accomplish the same thing. So you have like windrow systems, which are basically like being your home compost pile where you just have a lot of space and land and
Hmm.
you periodically turn it and you manage it that way, and you can manage a windrow pile very successfully and get great results. But in a lot of your cities, especially coastal, because of permit requirements and regulations in those states, you have to have a higher level of processing technology. So for instance, in Seattle, they have systems that have big covers that are come from the same family of as Gore-Tex does. They're covers that keep the heat in but breathe. And they also allow that pile to hit very high temperatures. So
Okay.
one big difference between home compostable and industrial is the temperatures you're going to hit in a highly controlled system are going to be much higher than what you're going to be able to accomplish with a pitchfork and a shovel at your
Okay.
house. So that's why it's important. You can't put meat in home composting or meat products, dairy, things like that, because
Hmm.
they need a higher level temperature wise and processing wise to actually break down. They also contain pathogens, which you don't want to put them out in your yard. So you need that temperature control, and weed seeds are another problem in a home
Sure.
composting system. If you can't, don't throw the dandelions in the
Yeah.
compost pile because they'll just come back when you put the compost out. So weed seed kill, pathogen kill, high temperatures, and then finally for compostables, there's a lot of materials in like the bioplastic or sort of the bioresin derived
Yes.
packaging that needs a lot of high temperature and to break down. And so if you think you're going to take, a portion cup from the stadium and bring it home and do the right thing and put it in your yard along with everybody else's, those are really not going to break down in your home compost pile because they'll never reach those temperatures.
Okay.
So those are the things just to keep in mind. Don't put compostables in your yard, in your backyard pile, and don't put meat, bones, anything that's pathogen laden, or anything that might have chemicals that would be persistent and end up, not breaking down through the microbial activity.
That makes sense. So it's really, if you have compostable like forks or spoons and you put them in your backyard heap, they're not going to break down because you really need the industrial conditions of the
Yes.
heat and the oxygen, which we didn't talk about, but I know we need oxygen,
Yes,
and
for sure.
turning, right? Keeping the pile turned.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Um, and then there's been a big push for sustainability, especially in this compostable space, where we see a push toward compostable packaging. Um, can you speak to some of the reasons why it's important to move this direction and why
Sure.
companies are moving in this direction?
Yeah, I think the drivers that I'm most familiar with over all the time I've been in this space is, people are really trying to minimize plastic pollution. So, traditional plastic pollution. The other thing is recycling systems over time. We don't have as much domestic recycling as we used to.
Mhm.
And so we're sort of recovering from a lot of materials going overseas. So the thing about composting, it's in your own neighborhood, your own region. You
Mhm.
keep your materials in your own community. So it's not going out, 300 miles away to a landfill, and it's not, going to another area where it can't be recovered and turned into something beneficial. So I think that, um, yeah, I think that the other driver is climate change. Climate change, compost production,
Mhm.
diversion from landfill, as well as applications, all have major climate change mitigation characteristics that we want. So whenever you use compost, you're really helping the environment, and helping us to avoid what happens with
Yeah.
climate change. And so that's another reason. And I would say finally, we have a lot more interest in getting food out of the landfill. 30 to 40% of what we throw away is food. So you have a lot more initiatives and pushes and policies pushing for more organics. And of course, if you're going to push for more organics, but you want to add it to the school district and the university, you're going to have to think about, the food service operations and,
Absolutely.
how are they going to eat? Because you're not going to put a bunch of plastic plates in a
No.
system that's got composting attached to
Right.
the end of it. So all those things are
Sure.
big
The whole
drivers for
system,
that.
it has to work together so that, like you said, if it is a food service environment, that everything at in that environment could be composted. So you have food and you have um, whatever kind of
Yes.
utensils or plates, and it can all go in the same place so that it's not difficult to separate them,
Yeah.
which kind of leads to the next topic, and that is like, are some materials better for composting than others? Um, and maybe we can talk a little bit about where does it make sense to start so that it's easy for people to assimilate to actually, separating compostable materials. So what are some of the good materials to start with? And we'll also talk about it a little bit more as we think about the future too, because like the infrastructure isn't quite there yet to adapt everywhere, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, great things. Obviously, food service packaging from dine-in operations is really what composters are set up to take currently.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that, and I want to say this the right way. Composters really aren't interested in packaging as a feedstock, and a feedstock's an inbound input, but they're interested in getting the food scraps from those, or commercial dine-in campuses and things, because that food, they're really trying to recover the food. So the packaging should always be seen as a carrier of food. So for instance, do we want a whole truckload of empty cups? No. They're not going to really make a lot of compost, and they're going to throw off our recipe a little bit. But a little bit of the teriyaki left from your house that you didn't quite finish in a compostable container that'll break down with it.
Yeah.
Um, the leftover peanut shells from the stadium, all those things can be put in, so we get the food scraps and the packaging together. So I would say, single use items that are just beverages. Yes, we want compostable cups, but that's not the main thing we're looking for. We're looking for those containers that create food scrap diversion, and that's really the area we like to stay in. I'll talk a little bit later though about retail, because I think there's opportunities
Yeah.
to expand compostables. But I'd like to talk about that as we move along.
Absolutely. So is it really then the food scraps that are generating the heat in the system, and that's why it's important to have a proper balance?
Yeah, there's a whole recipe. It's sort of, they need a certain moisture level. They need a carbon to nitrogen level of like 20 to 30 to 1. So that means a
Okay.
lot of browns like wood to greens like nitrogen. So browns are your carbons, greens are like nitrogen, high in nitrogen. But that's a recipe. Composters are manufacturers, and many of them have been doing this for 30 years. The recipe is everything, because at the end of the process, that manufacturing process needs to produce a consistent product that you're going to want to buy every year, and it looks and acts the same every year. So the compost quality is critical. And
Mm-hmm.
again, they're manufacturers, they're not dump sites, they're manufacturers. So we're very strategic about what we want to bring in to make that good compost. And
That makes
compostables can
sense.
play a role in making that better. Or they can also, there's other sides to it where if they're not properly identified, or they use the wrong ones, could actually invite contamination. So we're challenged on both sides of the
Got it.
fence. More food scraps, but less contamination. So that's currently what we really work on.
So then if a CPG company wants to consider compostable packaging for their products, can you talk a little bit about what makes a package compostable? Because there's a lot of greenwashing and there's a lot of good attempts but don't really work. Like you said, you get this contamination in the pile. So if companies want to make the choice to switch to a compostable material, how do they know it's actually going to be a material that you guys, that composters will receive in and be able to use, and it won't make the system worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for many years, there's sort of been a baseline of chemistry that product manufacturers developed way back in the 90s, that are published as ASTM standards, or American
Mhm.
Society of Testing Methods. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the technical place you go to look up how we do a technical, how we approach technical things related to
Hmm.
packaging and everything else. So the ASTM standards were developed in the 90s for compostables that basically check the toxicity of the material, making sure there's not heavy metals, making sure nothing in the constituency of that product's production is a problem if it was in the ground as compost.
Hmm.
It's also, checking its ability to actually biodegrade naturally into nature. So there's some biodegradables out there that actually don't turn into biomass and water, which is the end result you want with composting, but they
Yeah.
fragment into thousands of pieces. So those ASTM standards keep people in the lanes
Hmm.
of where those products have to stay to even make a claim of compostability. So ASTM 6400, ASTM D6868, those are the 6400 for monolayer materials, 6868 for multi-layer coated fibers. And then what CMA does in addition to that is we do a field disintegration test.
Okay.
So we're kind of doing the final thing is, will the composter have a problem with it? And we do a field test to give that manufacturer the assurance, we tested your material in this kind of process. It worked great. So you are officially certified in the CMA network of composters to send that in as a compostable.
And is that typically the material suppliers who are coming to you versus the manufacturers of consumer goods?
I would say both. Yeah, it's
Okay.
primarily the manufacturers, and then we work a lot with a lot of the material suppliers just because they're interested in giving their clients information on how their materials work should they make a structure from it. So we really work with both, but primarily the actual producers of the end product that goes out to market are our customers.
So people should be asking their packaging vendors if they're CMA certified to know that that material will work out in the
Yes.
system. Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
And
good.
the other thing that's important with our program is we're connected to a network of composters. So I like to say it this way, we're certifying for the receiving facilities of these materials, which was kind of a new concept when I started CMA. Because
Yeah.
generally it was just sort of all done in the lab. And then once it meets the lab standards, it's
Done.
compostable, it's out in the market, and then composters deal with it later. Like, what's this? I don't know what it is. So if you think about our recycling systems and how we're trying to get them back to being more robust and more domestically managed, we're
Yeah.
just trying to avoid what happened to recycling, because if we get further away from this manufacturer makes the cup and this manufacturer makes the compost, I like to say our model is working manufacturer to manufacturer. And it's interesting because operations people in packaging companies can relate to an operations person in a manufacturing plant. And a lot of times the sales and marketing people just need to get out of the way, and we can all work together on co-creating compostables and compost, but to do it thoughtfully and strategically, so we're improving both of our business models together. And that's really, what the intention was for CMA, is to create these partnerships that actually move the dial forward versus being separated, and later
Yeah.
everyone's investments are wasted because we didn't think about the fact that this is a systems
And you just end up with a lot of
program.
contaminated product that you've worked hard to create.
Yes, for
Yeah.
years. You're right.
Yeah. And I get a question once in a while about compostable packaging is great, but like I have to throw all my compostable packaging away because in my city they don't collect it. And it's only I think around 3%
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the,
I
the US has access to industrial composting facilities. And so where do you see um this industry going? So if a company is considering the investment in a compostable package, how long do you think it will take for that package to actually be composted and actually have facilities in municipalities around the country, right? Like
Yeah.
where do you see the push coming from? Because a lot of these companies are investing in the compostable packaging. It's typically more expensive, and so if only 3% of their consumers can actually dispose of that in the intended way, then how do people justify spending the extra money on that packaging?
Well, we always advise compostable packaging makes sense in cities that compost. So we don't promote that, we buy compostables. They may be more renewable, so they have advantages like that. But I think your point's a good one. That for some, manufacturers, we have these what we call, compost facility deserts, where we don't have the infrastructure. So what I would say to that is, part of the reason for that is, composting is a capitally intense business to start. Okay, especially now that you're seeing more and more regulations and everything. They also are dependent on having inbound feedstock. So you pretty
Mhm.
much have to win a contract for that, to know that you can go to the bank and say, here, I'm going to have a contract for 10 years composting for this city. And so I need my loan to dig my shovel and build my site. So there's a lot of finance things involved, but it's also policy driven and landfill rate driven. So case in point, when you come out to the coast, we have very high landfill rates here on the West Coast. and that makes the economic model for composting much better. If you get in states where they have very low landfill rates, if composting is significantly higher in cost to do, then it's really hard to justify. I mean, how do you, change all the rates of all the citizens for their garbage collection? It's very complicated economics. So I'd say one of the biggest barriers to building more for infrastructure is the financing. And I will say that there are some groups and VC groups now that are looking at really creating more funding for that, which we can talk about a little bit later. But I would say landfill rates and funding are the two barriers. But I also see a lot of activity, upstream and in terms of policies that are moving through states to really push composting as mandatory down the road.
Yeah.
So I think if investment and policies can catch up, I would hope that in the next 5 to 10 years you're going to see a substantial increase in siting facilities, keeping in mind that siting a facility can take 2 years or could take 10 years.
Yeah.
So a lot's going to have to depend on the regulatory community and their ability to speed up permitting and things like that, which get very, very complicated. But I have faith that we'll have some hopefully federal level, policies in the next few years that'll really push more investment and more support.
So once a community does start offering collection of compostable materials, is that a separate garbage truck? I know through my neighborhood I have like a trash and then a commingled recycled truck, and then would there be a third truck that would come collect a bin of compostables?
Yeah, well, most start as yard waste programs. That's where your volume is. So you have your residential yard waste, which we don't really promote a lot of packaging at home come in because, the education isn't there.
Yeah.
But in some cases, sure, the pizza boxes we accept and things like that. But when you get into commercial, I think that, that's where it's not franchise like residential, so it's an open market. You have more competition in commercial collection.
Got it.
So that's actually a good thing because I think it creates there's more market demand, means more options for collection that aren't franchised through a contract.
Sure, that makes sense. And then as we kind of think about the future, and you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, just some of the things that are changing. So maybe we can talk a little bit if you have anything else to say about changes in policy, but then I'd also like to talk a little bit about any of the changes that you see in the actual structures that you're able to compost, because initially we had these compostable materials. It was sort of like mono materials. You don't really, if it was a film, you weren't really getting great barrier, but now we're kind of moving toward more high barrier films, or at least films that protect the product better. So maybe it's even got a little metallization in it. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to those two areas for whatever you can offer. I know you don't make compostable film, but like you're seeing it kind of come through.
Yeah, I think, packaging in general has moved to the flexible packaging, so much of it now. And I would say that we've come to understand that they're not all mono anymore. So I think I think when things are materially similar, they do better in the piles. But if you have, for instance, if you take a paper and then a biopolymer and then a paper, if you mix like fiber and bioplastics, they tend to have a harder time.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's because the microbes that like paper, aren't the same ones that like the layer, but they have to get through two different kinds of materials. So I'd say if materials are more similar to each other in multiple layers, they probably would do better. But I think when you start mixing layers with different types of substrates, I would say that can, we found that can be a challenge.
Like slow it down. Is that what you mean by a challenge?
Yeah, that they only have so much time to disintegrate to a certain percentage.
Otherwise, you lose your heat, and then you lose the ability to break things down more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And too many layers too. So for what you're saying about packaging performance with consumers, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's sort of like when the first cutlery came out in Seattle and it only held up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. and I went to a mayor's event. I share this a lot. And I was watching people stir their coffee and pull out nothing but a stub, and they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "Wow." But the same manufacturer, 7 years later makes one that stands up to 170 degrees. So we've seen that migration from where it was to where it can be.
Yeah.
But if it's really hot or it goes in an oven, and it still is intact, that's a good sign that probably won't break that down that
Oh, I
well in
got
a
it.
pile that's 160 degrees. So heat tolerance is a challenge, and I don't know enough about barriers now to know how those might affect microbes or the
Yeah.
activity, because as packaging is newer and changing, again, we don't make packaging, but we just know how it looks. But I think what's been cool about CMA, I think for the first time really in my career that I know of, we have, packaging scientists talking to composting scientists for the first time.
That's
And a lot of
amazing.
folks designing compostable packaging have never even been to a composting site. So we're getting all this cross, training and understanding. CMA is also hosting a major compostables strategic plan. We just had a big event in March where we're actually getting everyone from the system together to share a vision for the future, because we're so disconnected. It's become a real challenge. But I have faith. There's
Yeah.
a lot of great people in all the spaces that we're talking about, with a strong desire to share a vision and build that roadmap
Yeah,
that
make
we
it
need.
better, right?
Yeah.
So are there any resources that you would point people to if they wanted to learn more kind of about where we're at now or where we plan on being in the future?
I think, the U.S. Composting Council is sort of our industry group association. It's come a long way, and I think, you know, subscribing to anything that they publish. There's a group that I was part of for a few years. I'm not involved anymore, but it's called Target Organics, and we literally spent 7 years trying to unlock the barriers to building infrastructure. So they've got a great toolkit. You could go on the U.S. Composting Council site and look at some of the various areas they've explored, and you can really learn a lot through the U.S. Composting Council. And a lot of states have organics councils as well.
Hmm.
Like in Washington State, we have the Washington State Organics Council. I believe Minnesota has the Minnesota, composting council.
Yeah.
So going to these, organics councils, you'll meet people. A lot of times they do events. So, and also your solid waste advisory councils. They're everywhere across the
Hmm.
U.S. If you have recycling and garbage, then they're going to have one in your town. So I just think those are areas that people don't think about. The solid waste world, learning about the
Yeah.
solid waste world and how you can donate time or your skills or knowledge. And I just think those are really important areas to explore.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing all of this. This was really fun to talk about composting.
Yeah, well,
And
we like it when people want to talk to us about composting.
absolutely. Well, thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's been great. And yeah, happy composting. It's spring. Go out and compost.
That's right.